You're listening to Collected, stories from the Australian War Memorial. I'm Louise Maher.
I was 16, you see, there's a photo of it up there. You know, it's all a bit of an adventure at that age. I'd just left school, you see.
That's the voice of Alec Campbell, the longest surviving veteran of the Gallipoli campaign and one of the youngest Australians to serve in the First World War.
After Gallipoli, I thought it'd be nice to get out of it, but I came through Gallipoli where a lot of more mature people didn't. It wasn't a good place to serve at all.
Alec was just 16 years old when he enlisted in the Australian Imperial Force. After a long, fruitful life, he died at the age of 103, commemorated in the national consciousness as the last Anzac, and as one of the possibly thousands of underage army servicemen, the Boy Soldiers.
The Boy Soldiers has become, I guess, a pet project of mine. It got under my skin.
Jennifer Millward is curator of private records at the memorial. She spent years researching and bringing to light the stories of the under-18s who went to war.
Back in 2013, one of the roles of my job was to manage the online encyclopedia, which had a list of boy soldiers. There were about 40 names on the list. Someone contacted us and said they had an uncle who was a boy soldier who wasn't on the list. So as the person looking after the encyclopedia, I looked into the story and confirmed he was a boy soldier. So I determined to add him to the list that was on the website. At that time, I have two sons, and one of them was 17, almost the same age as the boy soldier who had died. So it became very personal.
In this episode, we're focusing on World War I. So what were the enlistment rules at the time? Under the White Australia policy at the start of the war, men who were not of European descent were officially barred from serving. That included Indigenous and Chinese Australians. These restrictions, like others such as age, were relaxed as the war progressed. Megan Adams is a researcher and writer in the Memorial's Military History section.
There were always restrictions on who was eligible to enlist during the First World War, and some of these restrictions included things like height, weight, chest measurements, and of course age. So at the outbreak of the war in August of 1914, any man aged 19 to 38 was eligible to join. And having restrictions on these kinds of things allowed enlisting officers to control not only the amount of men who were rushing to enlist, but also to ensure that the men who were enlisting were the strongest and most fit soldiers that they could find. But by June 1915, which is only a couple of months after the Gallipoli landings, these restrictions are eased somewhat, and enlistment at that point is then opened up to any man aged 18 to 45. And so restrictions on age didn't change again during the rest of the war, but in mid-1917, the minimum height and chest expansion measurements were lowered even further to allow more men to enlist. So you can see that as the war goes on, restrictions around who can enlist become more and more lenient as the need for men outweighs the need for perfection.
So the official enlistment age never went below 18?
Never went below 18, that's correct.
There was an exception. Boys aged 14 to 17 could enlist as buglers, trumpeters, or other musicians. But not all the underage boys who went to the war could play a musical instrument. Also, anyone under the age of 21 needed their parents' written permission to join up. So how were underage soldiers able to enlist? As Jennifer explains, it wasn't that hard.
Many of them lied, obviously. They lied about their age. It was such a big adventure that they would do anything to get in. And some of them forged parents' signatures. Some of them blackmailed their parents. I know of stories of young men who said, if you don't let me go, I'll go anyway and I'll change my name. And then you'll never know what happened to me. We have the story of a young man from Melbourne who told his parents if they didn't let him enlist that he'd ride his bicycle to Sydney to enlist. We have certainly boys going interstate where they think no one will know them so that they can get away with enlisting and lying about their age. And then, of course, we have the attitude of the people who were accepting them at the time, the recruitment officers. Sometimes they just turned a blind eye.
And of course, Jennifer, it was a different time. Many children were forced to grow up a lot quicker than children grow up today. Then society had a different view of young men in their teens.
Absolutely, yes. Yes, we have to look at it through different glasses. We can't really judge by what we would say today. And also, sometimes these boys look like men. There's a story of one young man who was only 12 with quite a few siblings, and at the age of 12 became the oldest man in the family, and he was working to support a family at 12. So I could imagine that by the time he was 16 and having worked for 4 years, he looked like a man. So in some cases, the recruiters just wouldn't have known because there was no requirement to prove or provide any evidence of how old you really were. And also we've got to remember that it was 100 years ago. We've still got families who had very close ties to England, some whose parents may have even been English themselves. So it wasn't just a war on the other side of the world for them. It was real and it was close to home. It was their home that was at risk back in England. So you do have families with those close ties to England as well. Certainly there are families who are proud of the fact that their boys served and wanted to serve.
What did the authorities do if they discovered that there was an underage soldier in their midst? Were boys ever sent home?
They certainly were. There was a policy, I haven't found anything exactly written, but certainly the idea was that for some of the boys, if they were close to serving age, they would keep them occupied somewhere in England until they were old enough to be sent across to the front. Sometimes that involved them serving with the Australian Medical Corps in some capacity, just to fill in a bit of time until they were actually 18, when they could be sent to the front. Later on in the war, as the war seemed to drag on much more, there seemed to be a bigger push to have the boy soldiers sent home. The feeling became stronger that they shouldn't be there. And that's where you start to see passenger lists of troop ships coming home from England that have lists of boy soldiers actually on board. We have a few of those in the archives at the memorial that actually list perhaps a dozen or 20 boys who are being returned because they're underage.
The stories of 40 boy soldiers from the First World War are told in Paul Byrne's book, The Lost Boys. Haunting photographs show just how young the boys were. Jennifer helped Paul put those stories together. But for this podcast, she's chosen to highlight the stories of boys not featured in the book. We're starting with Private Francis William Williams, known as Frank, who was only 15 when he enlisted.
His service record actually reveals that he was probably known to have been a boy soldier. He was from Melbourne, a grocer. Rather sad, he lost his mother in 1911 and his father in 1915. So in 1916, in March, he actually enlisted 3 weeks after his older brother. So he followed his older brother, although interestingly, this young man actually embarked and left Australia 2 months after he enlisted in May, and his brother didn't actually embark until September. But they did actually end up in the same battalion together. They served in the 46th Battalion, and this young man went missing in action in April 1917. But what I was going to mention is that on his service record, it's a little bit incomplete, and it mentions that he marched into Codford in England, which was a base there, with a training battalion. But there's a note on his service record that says, now AMC probably, which suggests that somebody knew that he was underage and kept him back for a while. But he did then get sent to the front, even before he was 18. Unfortunately, he was killed in action on the 11th of April 1917. He was only 16 years and 8 months of age at the time of his death.
Frank's older brother Edward heard that Frank was missing and tried to find out what had happened.
And he did hear a report, and he wrote to his sister Annie that Frank was last seen alive at Lagnicourt, lying in a shell hole, badly wounded, on the 11th of April 1917. and never seen again. Very sad.
One of the other boy soldiers whose story you've investigated, Jennifer, is Lance Corporal Herbert West. Now, Lance Corporal, not private.
That's correct. Imagine being only 15 years old and promoted to Lance Corporal. Young Herbert, well, he was born in Botany in Sydney in September 1901, and he was only 14 years and 8 months when he enlisted in May 1916, so not even 15. He claimed to be 18 at the time. He embarked and went overseas in October 1916. He actually fought for 8 months in the trenches and then was promoted to Lance Corporal at age 15. He was wounded and returned to the trenches again, but unfortunately he didn't survive a second wounding. It's interesting that he survived so long in the trenches, and the reason I say that is in the research that I have done, so many boy soldiers actually only survived months, weeks, even days in the front line once they arrived there. So it's quite interesting that he managed to survive as long as he did. That's quite unusual.
Herbert died of shrapnel wounds to his back and upper arm 1 month after his 16th birthday. His application to enlist claims he'd produced a document recording his parents' consent, but his mother later said he did not have their permission. Herbert's 2 older brothers both survived the war. His portrait was displayed on a photo montage honour board made for the department store Anthony Horden's to commemorate 46 of the company's employees who died as a result of their war service. You can see Herbert's photograph on the memorial's website. You're listening to Collected, Stories from the Australian War Memorial. I'm Louise Maher. On the 19th of July 1916, Australian troops fought their first major battle on the Western Front. The Battle of Fromelles was a disaster, one of the greatest tragedies in Australian history. As Jennifer's discovered, some of the thousands who died and were injured should not have even been there.
On the first day of the action at Fromelles, the 5th Division alone suffered over 5,500 casualties, and we know of at least 11 boys that were killed that day. One of those young men who was actually wounded there is Private Charles Henry Benjamin Whitehouse. What's really sad about young Charles is that he was wounded in July and it was a full 2 months before he actually died. He suffered really terrible injuries. For example, from the Red Cross Wounded and Missing file, his left shoulder had a compound fracture of the joint. He had fractures of his forearm. He had wounds of his chest and his left leg. They had to amputate his arm at the shoulder. And then 2 months after being wounded, he actually died of septicemia in September 1917. So could you imagine 2 months suffering those kind of wounds before passing away? I just can't imagine what that can have been like for that poor young man.
Charles was an office clerk from Campsie in Sydney. So what prompted a boy like that to enlist? Like older soldiers, some were lured by the money, the need to support their families. Jennifer has also come across stories of boys escaping difficult family situations. Some, like Frank, were orphans, others had suffered abuse. But for many, the war was just a big adventure and a chance to see the world.
I can't really say why this particular young man enlisted, but what I would say is that if you recall back at that time, there were reports in the newspapers about our brave soldiers fighting overseas, and there was still a sense of adventure. And if you were a young man working as a clerk in an office, imagine seeing older brothers, fathers going off to have a big adventure overseas and you were stuck in an office. I think that for some of the boys, the thought of adventure and the thought of being left behind was very strong.
Tasmanian Edward Rose, known as Bob, was another boy who didn't want to be left behind. He went with his mother's permission.
He enlisted before he was 16. Although he was underage, his mother wrote that he so earnestly desired not to be retained for home service that she allowed him to go, and she wrote to headquarters asking if he could be kept from the firing line for a time on account of his extreme youth. He reached England with the 1st Training Battalion in April 1918, but unfortunately he caught measles, bronchitis, he suffered from oedemia of the lung, he got very sick, and he actually passed away in the training battalion before he even got to the front. So one of the problems, of course, that these young men suffered as being amongst a large group of men is that they could catch all sorts of diseases that were quite rampant on some of the ships that went overseas. And this is an example of one of those poor young men who didn't even make it to the front line. So his mother, Mary, received a reply from General Birdwood after asking to keep her son safe, telling her that her son, Private Rose, had died in May at Sutton Veny Military Hospital in England. General Birdwood wrote that, "I can only add how deeply I do sympathise with you both in the loss of such a really brave boy, for he did indeed display a fine spirit in enlisting when only 16 years old, with a determination to do his utmost for the noble cause for which we are fighting."
Is it true, Jennifer, that sometimes the military authorities use the example of these underage boy soldiers to encourage older men to enlist, to kind of guilt older men into signing up?
Yes, that certainly did happen. They were very proud of the boys being so brave, and I think it certainly was a way of perhaps shaming some men into enlisting. As the war progressed, of course, the numbers volunteering did drop, and they needed to use other ways of encouraging men to enlist. And I think it's unfortunate that, yes, there was an element of using these boys to push others to enlist.
Not all the stories about boy soldiers are sad. Many survived the war, including Alec Campbell, who we heard at the start.
We talk about all these boy soldiers that died, but we have to remember that there were hundreds of boy soldiers that we don't really know about because they lied about their age, they came home, and we don't know unless family historians are looking into the stories and discover that they were boy soldiers and let us know. We really have very little way of identifying how many boy soldiers there actually are who served. So it's lovely to have a story like Alex's story, because he was a young man who enlisted at 16, went overseas for the grand adventure that he thought it was going to be, unfortunately served on Gallipoli. After Gallipoli, got sick and ended up coming home. But he lived a lot of life afterwards. And it's lovely that there are men who survived the experience of being a boy soldier and came home and got on with their lives. It does give us some sense of balance, I suppose. Alec actually came home, and after the war he became a state president of the Australian Railways Union. He gained an economics degree. He became a boat builder and actually sailed 7 times in the Sydney to Hobart yacht races, had 9 children, 30 grandchildren and a lot of great-grandchildren. So there was a lot of life to be lived after his experience of enlisting as a 16-year-old.
In 1990, Alec travelled back to Gallipoli with other veterans to commemorate the 75th anniversary of the landing. When he was there as a boy, he was known as the Kid, as he carted water from the beach to the trenches. In a 1997 oral history, Alec was asked whether the war made him grow up quickly.
I never thought about it. And in some ways, I don't know. I don't know. I don't know what path I would have taken if I hadn't gone to the war. I'd have probably stuck in an insurance office. No, I don't know how to answer that one.
Curator Jennifer Millward continues to research the history of the boy soldiers, adding new names to the online list.
It's so important that we remember the service of all of our service personnel. I think that the thing about boy soldiers is it touches people's hearts because these are young men who never had a chance to live out the rest of their lives. I think that it all comes down to commemoration, and for some of these young men, there's nothing left. We can't find photos, there are no letters, there are no diaries. Apart from a name on a family tree, some of them don't even have that. And I think by telling some of these stories, we're commemorating the service of all of the boy soldiers as part of that and acknowledging their service and what they gave up. And I think that's part of what it means to say we will remember them.
And also commemorating the families. I mean, how awful to lose a loved one in the war anyway, but someone as young as 16, for example.
Absolutely, it's heartbreaking. In one of the service records of one of the young men that I researched, there was a letter from the mother who had written to the Department of the Army, and she wrote, "This war is so heartbreaking for mothers." And just reading those lines, having been written by a mother who lost her son, my heart goes out to the families and the mothers. As a mother of boys, how can you help but feel a sense of loss?
Thanks for listening to this episode of Collected, Stories from the Australian War Memorial. I'm Louise Maher. You can subscribe to the series by going to the Memorial's website or wherever you get your podcasts. See you next time.